The war ended in 1945, but the silence that followed was louder than the guns that had once shaken Europe. Victory parades and speeches spoke of liberation, yet within locked rooms in Moscow, Berlin, London, and Washington, other papers were signed, other truths concealed. Archives sealed with red wax and iron locks bore names erased from public record. Reports stamped Geheime Reichssache, most secret, and declassified with restrictions, told stories that never reached the newspapers. The public was shown the ruins of cities, the flags raised over Reichstag, the mushroom clouds above Japan. What they were not shown were the shadows beneath the official narrative. Massacres erased from ledgers, operations that never existed on paper, experiments written in the language of pain, and treaties inked in betrayal. The ghosts of these silences walk through forgotten streets of Lvov, across snowbound forests of the Ardennes, into the sterile chambers of Buchenwald, and onto the bridges of Austria, where desperate refugees were handed to their executioners. These are not myths, nor whispers of conspiracy, but fragments of suppressed files, fragments that survived fire, censorship, and the bureaucratic hunger to bury inconvenient truths. Each page recovered tells us not only of the crimes themselves, but of the deliberate machinery of silence that followed them. As we open these sealed dossiers, we step into the dim corridors where history was rewritten, where lives vanished without a trace, and where silence itself became the final weapon of war. This is forbidden history, resurfacing from the locked archives. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Massacre of Lvov. Ghetto. The city of Lvov, known today as Lviv in western Ukraine, carried scars that were never intended to be seen by the outside world. In June 1941, as German forces advanced under Operation Barbarossa, Soviet troops withdrew in haste, leaving chaos in their wake. Yet hidden within that chaos lay one of the darkest, least acknowledged atrocities of the entire war. A massacre that was deliberately erased, both by those who committed it and by those who feared the political cost of revealing it. The story was sealed away in NKVD vaults marked File Number 62 Black, a designation reserved for operations and incidents so volatile they were considered beyond propaganda, beyond even the brutal rhetoric of wartime politics. The ghetto itself was established under brutal efficiency. By November 1941, Lvov's Jewish population, numbering nearly 120,000, had been forced behind barbed wire. German command designated the district as a holding pen for unproductive elements, a term that camouflaged its true role in the machinery of extermination. The streets were narrow, overcrowded, and deliberately cut off from food supplies. Survivors would later describe the stench of starvation, the sound of boots on cobblestones, and the constant echo of gunfire beyond the walls. But what distinguishes Lvov from so many other ghettos was not only its destruction, it was the unnatural silence that followed it. No official Wehrmacht or SS reports mention the liquidation in detail. Soviet records after liberation in 1944 make almost no reference. It was as though an entire population had simply been made to vanish, without trace or testimony. German responsibility was undeniable, yet the massacre carried another dimension that made its suppression almost inevitable: the shadow of Soviet complicity. During the Red Army's retreat, thousands of political prisoners held in NKVD jails were executed before the Germans entered the city. When Einsatzgruppe C arrived, they exploited the discovery of corpses in prison yards, encouraging locals to vent their rage against Jews, falsely accusing them of collusion with the NKVD. Documents captured after the war, letters from SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Jeckeln, reveal a chilling plan. Cleansing protocols must be synchronized with Soviet withdrawals to ensure maximum effect. In effect, the massacre at Lvov was born from a macabre convergence of German brutality, local collaboration, and Soviet silence. Eyewitness accounts surfaced only decades later, often in fragments. A Polish resistance courier, codenamed Soa, wrote in 1942 that streets ran with blood for 3 days, and no one could enter without stepping on bodies. British intelligence intercepted similar descriptions through Enigma decrypts, but these were filed away under restricted distribution and never shared publicly. One decrypted German message spoke of live fire demonstrations being carried out in the ghetto, testing the performance of Mauser rifle ammunition on human beings. Another recorded an order from General Karl Eberhard Schöngarth authorizing synchronization with local auxiliaries, a phrase that masked coordinated killings by Ukrainian militias aligned with the SS. Bodies were left in courtyards, ditches, and open streets. Some estimates speak of over 30,000 killed in the first month alone. The environment of the massacre left a visual imprint so horrific that even hardened soldiers recoiled. Survivors described summer heat baking the corpses until the air was thick with decay. German soldiers forced Jewish prisoners to carry the dead to open pits, where lime was poured over them. Children were shot on sight, often in front of their parents. Entire families were herded into basements and set ablaze, a method later mirrored in other parts of occupied Poland. Yet despite the magnitude of death, official reports almost entirely omit these details. What appeared instead in German documentation was sterile language. Transports reduced, area secured, elements removed. The reality was so deeply buried beneath euphemism that the ghetto's fate became a phantom in the records of war. Why was this massacre so thoroughly erased? One reason was the uncomfortable overlap with Soviet atrocities. When the Red Army returned in 1944, they found a city stripped of its Jewish population. But Soviet propagandists avoided emphasizing Jewish suffering, instead framing Lvov as a site of fascist oppression against Soviet citizens. They had no interest in acknowledging their own role in sparking violence through the prison massacres of June 1941. NKVD files reveal internal debates, with some officers warning that publicity could invite hostile comparisons between Soviet and fascist methods. Thus, silence became policy. Western governments, bound by fragile wartime alliances, found it convenient to echo that silence. British Foreign Office memos classified in 1946 refer to Lvov only obliquely, noting incidents of civilian unrest exploited by German units. The people who lived through Lvov's destruction spoke rarely, often only in whispers decades later. A survivor, Rachela Baum, gave testimony in 1962 to the Yad Vashem archives. I remember the sound of boots and dogs, the smell of gasoline. We were herded like cattle. I saw a child shot because he cried. When the trucks left, silence remained, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. Her testimony was not used at Nuremberg, deemed of limited relevance. Many others never lived to tell their stories. Their absence became part of the silence. The streets where the ghetto once stood are now lined with apartments, shops, and schools. Tourists pass without knowing what happened beneath their feet. No official plaque marks the full scale of the massacre. For decades, Soviet historians wrote of resistance fighters in Lvov, but excluded Jewish voices entirely. In the West, scholarly focus shifted toward Warsaw and Krakow, where records were more accessible. Thus, Lvov's destruction remained a footnote until fragments of the suppressed files began to resurface after the Soviet collapse in 1991. Researchers uncovered references to Protocol 62 Black in KGB archives, confirming that the NKVD had deliberately suppressed documentation. At the same time, previously classified British decrypts were released, showing that the Allies knew of the massacre as it happened. The picture that emerged was one of deliberate silence on all sides. The massacre of Lvov was not simply an atrocity, it was an erasure. It demonstrated how easily history could be buried under euphemism, bureaucracy, and political convenience. Entire communities vanished not only physically, but from memory, their voices drowned beneath propaganda. The documents that remain, blood-stained notes, intercepted cables, fragments of testimony, are like broken glass scattered across a dark floor. They cut sharply against the smooth narrative of liberation and victory, reminding us that some of the war's most unspeakable crimes were not only committed, but carefully hidden. The story of Lvov forces us to confront a chilling reality. Truth itself was a casualty of war. When archives are sealed, when testimonies are silenced, and when governments find it easier to forget than to confront, history becomes a graveyard without names. The ghetto's destruction was not only a massacre of lives, but a massacre of memory. To reopen these files is to disturb that silence, to bring to light what was meant to be buried forever. And in doing so, we realize how much of our understanding of the war remains incomplete, how much still lies hidden in archives marked restricted, waiting for someone to break the seals. The forgotten massacre of Lvov Ghetto stands as both crime and warning, that the greatest weapon in war is not always the gun or the bomb, but silence itself. That silence allowed tens of thousands to vanish without acknowledgement. their suffering erased from the narrative of history. To tell their story now is to break that silence, to remind the world that truth can be delayed, distorted, and suppressed, but never destroyed. And as long as fragments of evidence remain, the voices of Lvov whisper from beneath the silence, demanding to be heard. Chapter 2. Operation Iron Wolf in the Ardennes. The Ardennes in December 1944 was a place of shadow and fire. Snow fell thick across the forests, muffling the thunder of artillery that rumbled in the distance. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would later be called, was already underway, a desperate German counteroffensive designed to fracture Allied lines and buy time for a collapsing Reich. Yet hidden beneath the official accounts of armoured thrusts and infantry manoeuvres was another darker plan. Classified in Gestapo File 1709 and referenced obliquely in decrypted cables from Bletchley Park, this operation carried the codename Eisenwolf, translated by Allied analysts as Iron Wolf. Unlike the massed assaults of tanks and men, Iron Wolf was a dagger aimed not at armies, but at the fragile trust between allies. Its goal was subversion, infiltration, and assassination. The operation was conceived within the SS, under the direction of Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the commando famed for his rescue of Mussolini in 1943. But Iron Wolf was not merely another special forces raid. Its files indicate a dual purpose, not only to disrupt Allied command and control, but to capture or kill figures whose disappearance would create political shockwaves. American generals, British liaison officers, even Soviet observers stationed near Allied headquarters were listed as assets for neutralization. A fragment of Jekyll's diary, captured in 1945, described the mission's strategic purpose. The wolf strikes not only at the sheep, but at the shepherd and his allies. The methods chosen were unorthodox. German commandos were trained to masquerade as American military police, complete with stolen uniforms, forged passes, and captured equipment. Thompson submachine guns, jeep vehicles, even packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes were issued to enhance the deception. Gestapo forgers created passes marked with authentic unit stamps, copied from documents seized in earlier battles. Some operatives had lived in the United States before the war, providing them with convincing accents and slang. The deception was so thorough that one American colonel, upon interrogating a captured commando, reportedly remarked, "If he had not hesitated at the word baseball, I would have believed him entirely." Iron Wolf's immediate objective was Eisenhower himself. Intelligence reports later revealed that his personal security was on high alert after Allied codebreakers intercepted fragments of German radio traffic mentioning der große Mann, the big man. Yet Gestapo File 1709 makes clear that the assassination was only part of a larger scheme. Another objective, buried in annexes labeled sensitive, was the retrieval of documents related to secret Allied negotiations in Switzerland. Even in the final winter of the war, emissaries from both sides were exploring channels for a potential surrender in Italy, and Berlin feared that such talks might signal broader betrayals. Capturing evidence of these negotiations would not only embarrass the Allies but also provide Hitler with leverage against dissenting factions within his own command. The snowbound landscape of the Ardennes provided the perfect cover. Convoys were frequently delayed or misrouted, communications were confused, and the chaos of battle made checkpoints vulnerable to deception. On December 16th, as the offensive began, Iron Wolf operatives slipped behind Allied lines disguised as MPs. They redirected traffic, sowed confusion, and sabotaged bridges. Reports from the US First Army later confirmed that road signs were switched, sending entire columns of tanks down the wrong routes. One unit of the 106th Infantry Division spent hours lost in forest roads, a delay that proved disastrous when German armor struck. These acts of sabotage were later attributed to general battlefield confusion, but declassified OSS cables make clear that Allied intelligence suspected deeper infiltration. The spectre of assassination spread fear through Allied headquarters. Eisenhower was confined to his office in Reims for days, surrounded by additional security. His movements were curtailed, his guards instructed to fire on anyone who failed to give the correct day's password. General Omar Bradley later wrote that the enemy had managed to make us suspicious of our own uniforms. American soldiers detained dozens of their comrades under suspicion of being German imposters, and several were even executed after summary trials. The paranoia was so pervasive that one US general was briefly arrested when he failed to answer a security question about the capital of Illinois. Yet what remains most haunting about Iron Wolf are the traces of its secondary mission, the elimination of political targets and the seizure of secret files. A declassified British War Office report, dated February 1945, mentions the discovery of American officers stripped of insignia, bodies left in roadside ditches. These killings were never explained in official histories. The locations corresponded to known courier routes between Allied forward headquarters and neutral Swiss intermediaries. It is possible, as some researchers have argued, that Iron Wolf succeeded in intercepting envoys carrying sensitive documents. If so, those documents have never resurfaced, likely destroyed in the chaos of Germany's final collapse or absorbed into Soviet intelligence archives. The atmosphere of Iron Wolf's operations was one of constant uncertainty. Snowdrifts concealed tire tracks, villages were abandoned, and the forest seemed to swallow sound. Survivors described the eerie sight of military police stopping vehicles, only for drivers to later discover that their supposed escorts spoke German when they thought no one was listening. The lighting was dim, headlights flickering through fog, shadows stretched by burning fuel dumps. In such conditions, deception was not only possible but inevitable. One American private, testifying years later, recalled, "We trusted no one. A familiar patch on a uniform meant nothing. Even the cigarettes in a man's pocket could betray him." The full extent of Iron Wolf's success remains unknown. Official Allied histories downplayed its significance, portraying it as little more than a minor commando raid. Yet archival evidence paints a more troubling picture. Bletchley Park decrypts show that Allied command intercepted messages referencing neutralization achieved and packages secured, phrases consistent with assassination or document capture. OSS reports indicate that an investigation into compromised couriers was launched in January 1945, though no findings were ever published. Meanwhile, Soviet archives contain vague references to German infiltration, units targeting political liaison, but the corresponding files remain classified. What is certain is that Iron Wolf spread fear far beyond its actual scale. Its legacy was psychological as much as tactical. By infiltrating the very symbols of authority, military police uniforms, official vehicles, forged papers, the operation eroded trust within Allied ranks. Soldiers questioned their comrades, commanders doubted their security, and suspicion became as deadly as bullets. In a war already defined by brutality, Iron Wolf demonstrated that deception could be a weapon as powerful as tanks and artillery. After the war, Iron Wolf was quickly buried beneath the larger narrative of the Battle of the Bulge. The Nuremberg trials made no mention of it, focusing instead on more conventional crimes. Skorzeny himself was tried but acquitted, his defense arguing that disguises in combat, while unconventional, did not violate established rules of war. The deeper objectives of Iron Wolf, assassination and intelligence theft, were never raised in court. Whether by deliberate suppression or simple neglect, the operation vanished into obscurity. Today, the Ardennes forests are quiet. Snow still falls in winter, covering the scars of tank tracks and shell craters. Tourists walk the same roads where convoys once burned, unaware that among the battles fought here was a hidden war of deception. The documents that survive, Gestapo File 17 and 9, decrypted messages from Bletchley, and scattered eyewitness accounts, are fragments of a larger story, one that hints at truth still locked away in classified vaults. Operation Iron Wolf was not merely a failed commando mission. It was a glimpse into the lengths the Reich was willing to go in its final days, turning even the fabric of Allied trust into a battlefield. Its legacy is a reminder that war is fought not only with weapons, but with shadows, that the line between soldier and spy can vanish in the snow, and that some operations are designed not to be remembered. For Iron Wolf, memory itself was the battlefield, and silence was its victory. Chapter 3. The Buchenwald Human Radio. Experiments Buchenwald concentration camp was a place already synonymous with cruelty, forced labor, and death. Yet hidden deep within its perimeter, in a compound known as Block 46, something unfolded that went beyond conventional atrocity. These were not merely acts of punishment or extermination. They were experiments, systematic, deliberate, and cloaked in secrecy, that sought to use human beings as living test subjects in a grotesque attempt to weaponize science. Among the most disturbing of these trials was a program buried under the codename Project Nachtsonne, the Night Sun Project. Classified documents later recovered in fragments describe attempts to harness electromagnetic frequencies, not for communication as the world believed, but as instruments of control, torture, and potentially mass destruction. The project began in 1942, when the Reich Main Security Office authorized special medical research under the supervision of SS physician Erwin Ding-Schuler. Officially, Ding-Schuler was tasked with vaccine development. In reality, Block 46 became a laboratory of horror. Reports marked Geheime Reichssache, secret Reich matter, refer to shipments of modified Telefunken radio equipment, coils and amplifiers delivered under the cover of medical supply consignments. Testimonies from survivors, sealed for decades, described prisoners strapped to metal chairs, electrodes fastened to their temples, as high-frequency waves pulsed through the air. The atmosphere was described as suffocating. The hum of machinery, the acrid smell of burning insulation, the flicker of dim lamps casting long shadows across tiled walls stained with blood. Inmates were forced to endure prolonged exposure, their bodies convulsing as if possessed, until seizures tore through their nervous systems. Records of these experiments were almost entirely destroyed as the Reich collapsed, but fragments survived in unlikely places. At Nuremberg, prosecutors uncovered annexes of evidence too politically sensitive to present. Among them were memoranda linking IG Farben to the supply of technical components. While most of these documents disappeared into Allied or Soviet custody, references linger in restricted trial transcripts. One such transcript, long suppressed, noted that tests concerning the biological endurance of subjects exposed to continuous electromagnetic induction resulted in terminal failure within hours. The language was clinical, almost sterile, masking the suffering behind words like endurance and failure. What it meant in human terms was the slow destruction of living prisoners, their organs failing one by one until death. The victims were not chosen at random. Many were Soviet POWs, brought to Buchenwald after capture on the Eastern Front. Others were political prisoners, communists, social democrats, or members of resistance movements. Their identities were reduced to numbers, their lives erased from camp records once they entered. Block 46. Witnesses later testified that guards referred to them as Stücke, meaning pieces, as though they were not human at all, but mere objects for study. Few ever left Block 46 alive. Survivors described the constant fear, the smell of burnt flesh from overloaded circuits, the metallic taste of blood in their mouths after seizures. One Polish prisoner recalled, "We felt the waves in our bones. Our heads burned from the inside, yet the room was cold. When one man screamed, the machine only hummed louder. Why pursue such experiments? The motives were twofold. First, to explore the possibility of using radio frequencies as weapons against enemy forces, and second, to test methods of breaking human resistance during interrogation. German command feared partisan uprisings and sought new ways to induce compliance without leaving visible wounds. Project Nachtsonne promised both. If it worked, a soldier's mind and body could be broken without bullets. But the science was crude, speculative, and ultimately lethal. There was no restraint, no ethical limit. Human suffering was simply the price of experimentation. When the Allies liberated Buchenwald in April 1945, they found Block 46 stripped of equipment, its records burned in furnaces. Yet traces remained. Scorched floor tiles, broken electrical conduits, and charred notebooks hidden in walls told fragments of the story. Survivors pointed to the block with trembling hands, whispering of the radio room. American investigators initially dismissed the claims as exaggerations, but as Operation Paperclip gathered momentum, interest in electromagnetic research grew. Some of the surviving scientists and technicians were quietly transferred to US facilities such as Fort Detrick, Maryland, where research into biological and unconventional warfare continued under new supervision. Soviet intelligence did the same, seizing equipment and personnel for research in Moscow. Thus, the crimes of Buchenwald did not end with liberation. They were absorbed, rebranded, and folded into the scientific ambitions of the Cold War. The suppression of evidence was deliberate. Publicizing the experiments would have exposed not only Nazi atrocities, but also Allied willingness to exploit their results. Nuremberg prosecutors faced political pressure to focus on crimes that could be clearly proven without implicating Western or Soviet interests. The victims of Block 46 were silenced again, their suffering erased under the weight of geopolitics. Only in classified annexes did their stories survive, bound in folders marked restricted distribution. For decades, historians knew nothing of Project Nachtsonne, while rumors circulated of death rays and brain experiments dismissed as fantasy. Yet fragments of testimony, declassified in the 1990s, confirmed that such horrors were not myth but fact. The environment of these experiments haunts every description. Survivors spoke of dim corridors lit by a single bulb, of guards standing in silence as prisoners writhed. The walls were bare, painted grey, the only decoration the iron insignia of the SS. The machinery itself was bulky, with humming generators and cables snaking across the floor. The sound of the radio waves was described not as audible, but as felt. A pressure inside the skull, an invisible weight pressing down on the chest. Victims often collapsed with blood pouring from their ears and noses, yet were revived only to be subjected again. Death was not immediate. It came slowly, through exhaustion, cardiac arrest, or brain hemorrhage. The cruelty lay not only in the method but in the repetition, day after day, until no strength remained. The silence surrounding these crimes was perhaps the most insidious element. Families of victims received no records, no graves, only the bureaucratic phrase, disappeared. Post-war trials mentioned Buchenwald's medical crimes in general terms, but not the radio experiments. Researchers seeking evidence found archives sealed, files missing, and witnesses too afraid to speak. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did scattered documents emerge from Moscow's archives, referencing German experimentation with high-frequency induction for tactical purposes. Even then, details were redacted, names removed, and locations obscured. The truth was allowed to surface only in fragments, as though history itself resisted exposure. The Buchenwald human radio experiments force us to confront a question. How many other truths remain hidden in classified vaults, unacknowledged because they implicate not only the perpetrators, but those who profited from the aftermath? These experiments did not vanish in 1945. Their legacy lived on in Cold War research, in programs exploring electromagnetic effects on human physiology, in classified laboratories where silence was enforced by secrecy laws. The victims of Block 46 remain nameless, buried in unmarked graves, their suffering preserved only in whispers, half-burned files, and fading memories. To speak of them now is to break a silence imposed for decades. It is to recognize that some of the most horrific crimes of the war were not public massacres witnessed by thousands, but secret experiments hidden in locked rooms, committed in the name of science and erased by politics. Block 46 at Buchenwald was not just a site of human suffering, it was a symbol of how knowledge, when stripped of morality, becomes an instrument of death. The hum of the machines may have ceased, the corridors may stand empty, but the echoes remain. They remind us that silence can be as deadly as violence, and that truth, once buried, carries the weight of every life lost in darkness. The Buchenwald experiments were unspeakable, not because they defy description, but because for decades they were forbidden to describe. Only by dragging these shadows into the light can we begin to grasp the full cost of what was done, and of what was concealed. Chapter 4: Stalin's Hidden Pact of Repatriation. The war had ended. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its people displaced across borders that had been shattered and redrawn. In the celebratory speeches of 1945, victory was portrayed as liberation, and the Allied powers presented themselves as the guardians of freedom. Yet behind the triumphal parades, another story was unfolding, one so dark that governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain conspired to bury it. It was the story of Operation Keelhaul, a secret pact of forced repatriation that condemned hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children to a fate worse than exile. At its heart was an agreement between British intelligence and Stalin's NKVD, carried out in silence and concealed under layers of diplomatic secrecy. For those handed back across the Soviet lines, there would be no liberation. There would be interrogation, execution, or the slow death of the Gulag. The origins of the pact trace back to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin redrew the post-war order. Amid the negotiations over borders and occupation zones was a quiet but critical commitment: the forced return of all Soviet citizens who had ended up in Allied-controlled territory, regardless of their wishes. In practice, this meant not only Red Army soldiers who had been taken as prisoners of war, but also civilians who had fled the brutality of Stalin's regime, Cossacks who had fought alongside Germany against the Soviets, white émigrés who had escaped during the Russian Civil War, and even innocent families who had sought refuge in the West were all marked for return. The NKVD demanded them, and the Allies, desperate to preserve their fragile alliance with Stalin, complied. The logistics of Operation Keelhaul were carried out with military precision. British and American forces organized camps in Austria, Italy, and Germany, where displaced persons were gathered under the pretense of resettlement. Barbed wire watchtowers and armed guards ensured that escape was nearly impossible. Eyewitnesses later described the atmosphere of betrayal. Soldiers who had greeted refugees as allies were now ordered to herd them onto trains and trucks bound for Soviet lines. One British officer wrote in a private letter, later declassified, "We were ordered to deliver them like cattle." Many knew they were going to their deaths. Some threw themselves under the wheels of the trucks rather than be taken. The sense of dread was palpable. Families clung together, children screamed, and priests prayed aloud, their voices drowned by the roar of engines. The handovers were conducted at night, under cover of darkness. At border points such as Judenburg in Austria, convoys of refugees were delivered into the waiting hands of NKVD officers. Trucks with blacked-out headlights moved silently along mountain roads, their cargo sobbing, pleading, or sitting in stunned silence. British troops formed cordons, ensuring no one escaped. Mothers begged for mercy, thrusting their children into the arms of Allied soldiers. But the orders were strict. No exceptions, no asylum. Once across the border, NKVD guards separated men from women, officers from civilians. Many were executed on the spot. Others were packed into cattle cars for transport eastward. For those sent to Siberian labor camps, survival meant years of starvation, frostbite, and forced labor in mines and forests. Few ever returned. The scale of Operation Keelhaul was staggering. Estimates range from 1.5 to 2 million people repatriated between 1945 and 1947. Among them were entire divisions of Cossack fighters who had surrendered to the British, believing they would be granted asylum. Instead, they were delivered to the Soviets in mass transfers. A particularly infamous case occurred in May 1945, when approximately 30,000 Cossacks were handed over near Lienz, Austria. Witnesses described scenes of chaos as Cossack officers were beaten unconscious to prevent resistance, while their families were torn apart by force. Many committed suicide rather than face Soviet retribution. The British records of these events were classified for decades, marked not to be released until 2000, ensuring that generations would pass before the truth emerged. The political rationale behind the operation was cold and pragmatic. The Western Allies feared that refusing Stalin's demands would jeopardize cooperation in post-war Europe. Churchill himself, despite private misgivings, signed off on the repatriations, arguing that the future stability of Europe requires difficult compromises. American officials echoed the sentiment, framing the handovers as a matter of honoring agreements. Yet the moral cost was immense. Soldiers tasked with enforcing the transfers were haunted by what they had seen. Some deliberately looked the other way as refugees tried to escape. Others disobeyed orders outright, allowing small groups to slip away. But these acts of conscience were exceptions. The machinery of Operation Keelhaul ground on, fueled by the weight of international politics. What made the operation even more insidious was its secrecy. Official reports described the repatriations in euphemistic language, using phrases like resettlement and population transfers. Publicly, the Allies spoke of humanitarian relief and reconstruction, while privately, they delivered refugees into the hands of their executioners. Journalists were kept away from border transfer points. Soldiers who witnessed the events were instructed to remain silent. Files documenting the operation were sealed in British and American archives, their release postponed for decades. When fragments finally emerged in the 1970s, they were met with disbelief. Could the same governments that had fought for freedom have colluded in such betrayal? The answer lay in the classified memos, the signatures of officials who had weighed lives against alliances and chosen silence. The human stories behind these statistics are devastating. Testimonies smuggled out of the Soviet Union decades later speak of children dying in transit, of men executed in front of their families, of women assaulted by guards before being sent to camps. One survivor recalled, "We believed the British uniforms meant safety. Instead, they delivered us to Stalin's wolves." For many, the betrayal was worse than the suffering itself. They had placed their faith in the West, only to be abandoned for political expediency. The legacy of that betrayal still lingers in the memories of communities scattered across Europe and beyond. In retrospect, Operation Keelhaul was more than a single event. It was a template for how governments conceal uncomfortable truths. Its secrecy, its euphemisms, and its suppression of evidence foreshadowed the methods of the Cold War, when inconvenient realities were hidden behind classified files. To this day, some details remain obscured. Russian archives contain references to special repatriation operations in the late 1940s, but access is restricted. British archives released only partial documents, many with entire pages redacted. The silence persists, a continuation of the very secrecy that defined the operation. The hidden Pact of Repatriation stands as one of the most suppressed stories of World War II. It reveals the brutal logic of realpolitik, where human lives were expendable in the service of alliances. It exposes the fragility of moral victory, reminding us that liberation was not universal, that for some the end of the war marked only the beginning of new suffering, and it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that betrayal was not the act of a single regime, but a shared decision, signed in ink by the victors themselves. The refugees who vanished into the night convoys of Operation Keelhaul may never be named, but their silence speaks louder than any parade, reminding us that history is written not only in triumph, but also in the shadows of its betrayals. The war that consumed Europe ended in a blaze of victory parades, treaties, and promises of peace. Yet the deeper one looks into the archives, the clearer it becomes that the silence afterward was more deliberate than the cannon fire that came before. Files marked restricted, testimonies locked in vaults, and cables written in a language of euphemism point to stories carefully buried. Lvov, where tens of thousands vanished in days, erased from both German and Soviet memory. The Ardennes, where men in stolen uniforms sowed paranoia and left bodies stripped of insignia in frozen ditches. Buchenwald, where the hum of machinery mingled with human screams in rooms designed for experiments that no one was supposed to know existed. Austria, where Allied trucks rolled under darkness, carrying families not to freedom but into the hands of their executioners. Each of these was not simply an atrocity, it was a crime designed to be forgotten. The question that lingers is how many more remain buried, sealed in vaults of Moscow, London, or Washington, their details redacted, their names erased. If these 4 files surfaced, despite every effort to destroy them, what lies still hidden beneath layers of official silence? The ghosts of those betrayed by history walk quietly, but their shadows are long. In every archive sealed, in every testimony suppressed, they wait. And as time passes, one truth becomes undeniable. The war never truly ended. It continues in silence, in secrets, and in the stories we were never meant to hear.